Давай, Тошка, следи. Будь на полиции, сейчас копал кило. G'day, I hope you're having a good day. A very interesting article and something that's been incredibly controversial has been released from Amnesty.org. Amnesty is like a massive NGO, over 10 million members who basically investigate solo, private, humanitarian crisis, war crimes, things of that. Now, I've been very critical of Amnesty before for not actually providing much context with some of these claims that they make. And I think that anyone, if you look at Amnesty as a whole, you can see that it definitely sits on the more left-wing progressive side of the narrative towards a lot of things. And a lot of people really point fingers saying it's just a social justice warrior platform, which this article really, really surprised me, because that side of politics, if you want to play sides of politics, is more the side that is backing Ukraine, rather than if you look at like the very conservative side, which is more like, hey, that's that war. Why are we involved in this? Just let them fight it out. And that's why this has been very surprising to me. I didn't think Amnesty would actually pick this up. Before we jump into it, I think something very important to put as well is it's not like this is the only thing they've released on this conflict. They've got full pages and everything of Russian war crimes and Russian humanitarian issues and everything that was released basically from day one of this conflict. It's not just they've released one thing. But my main critique is it may not provide too much context. So I'm hoping, I guess, to go through this with you and maybe provide some context and maybe see my opinions on it. It's only the second time I've read it, so we'll see how we go. So it's titled Ukraine. Ukrainian fighting tactics endanger civilians. And the checkpoints, there's military bases set up in residential areas, including schools and hospitals. Attacks launched from populated civilian areas. Such violations in no way justify Russia's indiscriminate attacks, which have killed and injured countless civilians. Now, I think this is a very important thing, is they're not trying to justify anything that Russia has done here, but it doesn't mean that there's two laws. It doesn't change anything. Okay, Ukrainian forces have put civilians in harm's way by establishing bases and operating weapons in populated residential areas, including schools and hospitals, as they repelled the Russian invasion that began in February, Amnesty International have said. This is not a lie. I'm sorry if this goes against a lot of media narrative or not narrative. This is not a lie. You can see back from my old videos, even pre-war, when I was walking around some of the frontline towns, that there were soldiers and positions and whatever within built-up areas. And of course, they have weapon systems, and I have very much seen tanks parked up in residential car parks and tanks under like abandoned service stations and things like that, but in some populated areas. And still, there are soldiers here, including schools and hospitals. Hospitals I can't speak on. I've had no experience with that. The hospitals are kept very quiet. But within the attack, I don't know. Schools is something that I know that both sides have been fighting within. I've been to 3 schools, I believe. One of them was still littered with Russian bodies and expelled ammunition. And I have no doubt that there has been fighting within their schools, but and these hospitals. I guess where the context sits in this is, well, it's a little bit different if it's an abandoned school and you've gone there and you're shooting out of it, to going into a school that's got classes in it and whatever. I think something that we haven't really had any experience with yet, because the last war of this scale in Europe, in as densely populated areas of this, with 2 conventional armies, has been in World War II. In World War II, were the Germans or the Americans or the Italians or the French, were they fighting door to door in densely populated areas? Yeah, that was happening. And it's hard to... I'm not trying to justify any of this. There has been a lot of evidence through a lot of... You can look on Telegram, you can see it every single day, of a weapon system being operated in a built-up area. And I am completely against any of that happening. I think both sides need to be ashamed of themselves of some of that happening. But I guess what's the other solution here? Where does that go? What actually is a civilian area that you'll go out into this field where there's nothing? But if you do that, you're just going to get absolutely fucked up. Such tactics violate international humanitarian law and endanger civilians, as they turn civilian objects into a military target, thus ensuring Russian strikes in populated areas have killed civilians and destroyed civilian infrastructure. That is something that is very true, but does have some, I guess, context issue, but they are correct in this. I have seen a lot of stuff. When I was in Bucha and Irpin, I was walking around with a fixer, and see that hole up there, a Russian tank fired straight into that building and killed a heap of people in that building. And I'm like, oh shit, that's horrific. He's like, yeah, there was a guy firing RPG out of it at the tank. And I'm like, well, and I'm not signing to anyone here, but if you're in a fucking tank and an RPG comes out of a window, that turns that into a target. I'm not justifying either side of this, but if they traverse and drop 125 mil into that out of its gun, you can't. It's hard to really explain that away. And there's been a lot of things I've seen vary amongst these lines that it's been maybe reported on through state media or some of the Western media as just completely like, oh, this is a civilian target, or just indiscriminately bombed this civilian area. And then a few days later, but it's not trending in the news anymore, some more evidence comes out and you're like, oh, well, maybe it wasn't that civilian-y. Like, maybe it doesn't say there weren't civilians living there. It weren't saying that those civilians deserve any of this. And I'm not saying that they backed having someone with an RPG in their fucking roof. But there's been multiple videos of firing javelins off rooftops and whatever, and being in amongst that urban warfare environment. We have documented a pattern of Ukrainian forces putting civilians at risk and violating the laws of war when they operate in populated areas, says Agnes Calmard, Amnesty International's Secretary General. Being in a defensive position does not exempt the Ukrainian military from from respecting international humanitarian law. That is a very important statement, and that is very true. That just because it's not reported on and it's not whatever, just because you are the victim of this, and Ukraine is the victim of a Russian aggressive attack, of a Russian invasion, but that does not exempt you from these laws and from being held accountable and where it needs to be held accountable. Everyone has seen the video of, and it's a savage video, and it is a war crime, and you should be fucking thrown into the gallows, of the Russian soldier removing the testicles of a Ukrainian soldier with a box cutter. That is a straight war crime and should be thrown in the gallows. But there was also another video come out a lot earlier in the war that didn't really, I guess not as many eyes saw, of a Ukrainian soldier stabbing a Russian soldier to death in, I guess, in an execution-style video. Now, both of these are the same. And one was reported as Russian army and one was reported as a rogue soldier. They need to be held accountable in the same way. Not every Russian attack documented by Amnesty International followed this pattern. However, in certain other locations in which Amnesty International concluded that Russia had committed war crimes, including some areas of Kharkiv, and the organisation did not find evidence of Ukrainian forces located in the civilian areas unlawfully targeted by the Russian military. I had been in that exact place a few months ago, and the area where I filmed was within a civilian complex structure where there was still civilians living and soldiers living as well, hand in hand. It's just one of those things that is so hard to, like, what is the solution to that? But also, like, you can't say that it's a good thing. It's such a complex issue there of, like, what is a military target? What is a civilian target? I know the law on it is probably black and white, but it is difficult. Between April and July, Amnesty International researchers spent several weeks investigating Russian strikes in the Kharkiv, Donbass and Mykolaiv regions. The organisation inspected strike sites, interviewed survivors, witnesses and relatives of victims of attacks and carried out remote sensing weapon analysis. Throughout these investigations, researchers found evidence of Ukrainian forces launching strikes from within populated residential areas, as well as basing themselves in civilian buildings in 19 towns and the villages in the regions. The organisation's Crisis Evidence Lab has analysed satellite imagery to further corroborate some of these incidents. Most residential areas where soldiers located themselves were kilometres away from the front lines. Viable alternatives were available that would not endanger civilians, such as military bases or densely wooded areas nearby, or other structures further away from residential areas. In the cases documented, Amnesty International is not aware that the Ukrainian military who located themselves in civilian structures in residential areas asked or assisted civilians to evacuate nearby buildings, a failure to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians. This is something that's very difficult. It's something I want to get into in the next coming days with some interviews down at the front line, is why have these civilians not yet evacuated from these regions? And I can give you a few reasons now from some of my talking to some locals, has been because they feel that there's more work opportunity in Russia than there is in Ukraine. That if they're on the front line, there's no work currently because they're in the war, and they can see that Russia is advancing. And some of the reasons, and this is secondhand information from a fixer, and I'm hoping to get some of this firsthand, but was that they believe that once Russia overtakes and things return probably more normalish than throughout the invasion, then they'll be able to pick up work and do and live a life. Yeah, it's under a different government, a different organisation, and I'm not saying that anyone should have to, change, I guess, their identity of who they are because of an invasion, but that's the reason some have not left. But I do believe that there is some level of responsibility some civilians may need to take in a war like this. There are areas on the front line that have, obviously, as this article is saying, they have evidence that soldiers have been living in this building for X amount of time. Where is the responsibility that after 6 months that you become a refugee and leave? No one should have to do that. I'm not saying you should have to do that, but at what point do you go, fuck, I need to leave? And the options available within Europe of refugees through to fully paid accommodation, housing, food, and then even weekly sums of money given. I know it's shit. I know it fucking sucks, but do you think that civilians hold a responsibility to also take all means necessary to get out of that area at a safe moment in time? Launching strikes from populated civilian areas. Survivors and witnesses of Russian strikes in Donbass, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv regions told Amnesty International researchers that the Ukrainian military had been operating near their homes around the time of the strikes, exposing the areas to retaliatory fire from Russian forces. Amnesty International researchers witnessed such conduct in numerous locations. International law requires all parties to a conflict to avoid locating to the maximum extent feasible military objects within or near densely populated areas. The obligations to protect civilians from the effects of attacks include removing civilians from the vicinity of military objectives and giving effective warning of attacks that may affect the civilian population. On this, giving effective warning. Apparently, and this is like 50th hand information, but apparently the governments knew that on the 24th of February that Russia was going to invade, but didn't want to create panic and therefore did not release that however long they knew before. Does that go into that? I'm not sure. Scrolling weird. The mother of a 50-year-old man killed in a rocket attack on the 10th of June in a village south of Mykolaiv told Amnesty International the military was staying in a house next to our home and our son often took food to the soldiers. I begged him several times to stay away from there because I was afraid for his safety. That afternoon, when the strike happened, my son was in the courtyard of our home and I was in the house. He was killed on the spot. His body was ripped to shreds. Our home was partially destroyed. Amnesty International researchers found military equipment and uniforms in the house next door. In the interview that I have done probably 1 or 2 videos before this with a foreign fighter or foreign mercenary, however you see it, he talks openly about we would just go into civilian houses and just work from there because we're just operating within civilian environments. And there are more coming with some foreign fighters as well. Mikola, sorry if I've stuffed up a name, who lives in a tower block from a neighborhood of Lysychansk, Donbass, was repeatedly struck by Russian attacks which killed at least one older man, told Amnesty International. I don't understand why our military is firing from the cities and not from the field. Another resident, a 50-year-old man, said, there is definitely military activity in the neighborhood. When there is outgoing fire, we hear incoming fire afterwards. Amnesty International researchers witnessed soldiers using residential buildings some 20 metres from the entrance to the underground shelter used by the residents where the older man was killed. In one town in Donbass on the 6th of May, Russian forces used widely banned, inherently discriminate cluster munitions over a neighbourhood of single or two-storey homes where Ukrainian forces were operating artillery. Shrapnel damaged the walls of the house. Anna, 70, lives her son and 95-year-old mother. Anna said shrapnel flew through the doors. I was inside. The Ukrainian artillery was near my field. The soldiers were behind the field, behind the house. I saw them coming in and out. Since the war started, my mother is paralysed, so I couldn't flee. I guess that answers one of the things I asked before. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these. I'll launch this I'll link this entire thing so you can read through it and go through it yourself. Amnesty International researchers witnessed Ukrainian forces using hospitals as de facto military bases in 5 locations. In 2 towns, dozens of soldiers were resting, milling about, or eating meals in hospitals. In another town, soldiers were firing near the hospital. A Russian strike on the 28th of April injured 2 employees at a medical laboratory in a suburb of Kharkiv after Ukrainian forces had set up a base in the compound. Using hospitals for military purposes is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. I will say I don't have any experience with this, just because the being allowed anywhere near there is just completely just not within my scope of what I can do. But I will say there have been a lot of videos of ambulances being used, marked, ambulance with crosses, whatever, for moving soldiers around with weapons, with whatever. And I know for a fact from my time in the military, any vehicle that is like with ambulance and the Red Cross on it cannot have weapons inside of it. And I have seen multiple images come out that have been leaked and whatever of that exact thing happening. Military bases in schools. The Ukrainian military has routinely set up bases in schools and towns and villages in Donbass in the Mykolaiv area. Schools have been temporarily closed to the students since the conflict began, but in most cases the buildings were located close to populated civilian neighbourhoods. 22 out of the 29 schools visited, Amnesty International researchers either found soldiers using the premises or found evidence of the current or prior military activity, including the presence of military fatigues, discarded munitions and army ration packs and military vehicles. Russian forces struck many of the schools used by Ukrainian forces in at least 3 towns. After Russian bombardment of schools, Ukrainian soldiers moved to other schools nearby, putting the surrounding neighbourhoods at risk of similar attacks. And I'll cut that bit short there because I guess you can read the full thing. It's still condemning the Russian attacks, but it's just backing evidence of like, hey, we went there and this is what we saw. We went to 29 schools and 22 of them had this. I have from first-hand attacks. I've seen both sides operating in fucking schools on both sides of fucking Telegram, whatever. And from my experience going into school and seeing dead bodies of soldiers from both sides out the front or on the ground shot or whatever. And then in one school in the gymnasium, there was boxes of like ammunition boxes and old boxes that I presume had like some sort of rocket launcher, and I didn't recognize it because it's Soviet equipment. I'm not really familiar with exactly what it was, but it's 100% military equipment. Indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces. Many of the Russian strikes that Amnesty International documented in recent months were carried out with inherently indiscriminate weapons, including internationally banned cluster munitions. That is somewhat incorrect, and I've done a video on this. It is internationally banned if you've signed the Geneva Convention that bans these munitions. Both Ukraine and Russia have not signed this, so it is banned amongst or myself, and if you live in a country that assigns Geneva, but it is not internationally banned for these countries to use. So I was actually very incorrect when I stated that. I stated that first line in my video, and I had to actually delete it, re-upload, and correct myself on that after I learnt a bit. Or with other explosive weapons with wide area effects. Others used guided weapons with varying levels of accuracy. In some cases, the weapons were precise enough to target specific objects. There's a video I've done, we're all actually releasing on this, that there was a caliber missile hit a civilian building and killed one person, sadly. And it was reported everywhere that Russia was indiscriminately targeting that building. And when I was there filming, I turned my back to the building, my camera in front of me, and as soon as I did that, like videoing, I was told, no. And I'm like, oh, why can't I film that way? And like, oh, that's a military factory. It hasn't been running in a long time. Now, I don't know if it was running. I'll believe that it wasn't running. But I'm like, oh, so that was a military factory right there, and this civilian building here. And the weapon just was inaccurate and hit this building. Now, I'm fucking not saying therefore people deserve it. Of course I'm bloody not. But it was 20 meters away from a factory. The Ukrainian military's practice of locating military objectives within populated areas does not in any way justify indiscriminate Russian attacks. It's incredibly true. All parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between military objective and civilian objects and take all feasible precautions, including choice of weapons to minimise civilian harm. Indiscriminate attacks which kill or injure civilians or damage civilian objects are war crimes. It's incredibly true. Quote, the Ukrainian government should immediately ensure that it locates its forces away from populated areas or should evacuate civilians from areas where the military is operating. Just end quote there for 1 second. The Ukrainian government did announce maybe 3 days ago, it is the 5th today, so I reckon it was either the 1st or the 2nd, that it is evacuating 500,000 people from the Donbass region. But from what I've heard of people working there, other journos, other whatever, there's very little people leaving because they're like, we're here now, we're staying. Okay, back to this. Quote, militaries should never use hospitals to engage in warfare and should only use schools or civilian homes as a last resort where there are no viable alternatives. Now, that's a very interesting thing because I would like to know, were there legitimately viable alternatives? Like in those beginning few days, Russia moved fucking quick across the land. They invaded. It's a superpower. And recently, Russia has been moving in incredibly fast. There was a lull there for a few months, but if you look at the maps in the past, say, week, Russia has really been making a lot of ground. So I can't say if they were viable alternatives or not, but like it says, it should be the absolute last resort. And this was their findings as of the 29th of July of 2022. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has not responded yet. Now, I've made this very clear that I think this war, it might be glorious to some on both sides who look on social media or look at whatever. But if you go and see what is happening to these people and the amount of deaths every day from both sides, it is absolutely fucking insane. It is crazy. And there has been some parts missing in this. They have not been to the Russian side and reported on if Ukraine has, drop bombs within Russian areas, and also the evidence that is coming out of Ukraine dropping petal mines. Petal mines are meant to look like a petal, like something falling off a tree in areas, so you can't see them and tread on them, and anti-personnel mine and maim you. There's been more and more evidence of that. I have no evidence of that, but that is something that I've seen pop up more and more and more. This really did surprise me, this article from Amnesty. I didn't think that they would have something that, I guess, put Ukraine looking in a bad position in some stuff. I was very surprised when I saw this come out. And I think that is one of the reasons it actually has some maybe credibility, is it's very out of where I'd actually think Amnesty would lie, at least their social outlook on things. So it's a very interesting article. But I'm saying that there's evidence on both sides of this happening, and the civilians should not be caught up in this at all. And I believe that the government has a right, and everyone probably agrees that it's not a right. The government has everything that they should have everything in their power to try and protect civilians. And the best thing, and it's the toolbox of the government to protect civilians, is to stop a conflict like this happening and taking all necessary steps leading up to this. And once a conflict like this happens, still take, if they can, diplomatic steps to see if there can be a peaceful end. And there has not been at all. I'll be very interested to see what happens with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, because Russia is denying this, but Ukraine is claiming that Russia is using that power plant as a munition storage, because of course, to actually have a major strike on a power plant is absolute fucking death sentence. But there has been multiple suicide drone attacks that Russia is claiming were Ukraine striking that facility. And that's something I'll talk about more in tomorrow's. I'm sorry if this has been very long, but I just wanted to bring this article to you. I can't verify... Actually, no, I can. I can verify some parts of this article as being correct. I can't verify it all. But it's worth reading this and then reading their one about Russia and making up your own mind, because they've actually done an investigation, and that I think any journalist who works here, anyone who's worked here, is not surprised by the claims made in this at all. I'm not surprised by any claim made in this. But the journalists who have the balls to stand on CNN or Fox or whatever and talk about this, no way. They still need to keep their job. They need to keep their accreditation to work. I believe it's they might think it's in their personal best interest not to, but they should. There was a video I saw yesterday from a Western media outlet of a kid who dug a trench and has an AK, and he's like, oh, we'll kill any Russian who comes down this road. And this is like an 8-year-old boy. And I'm like, we're reporting this as like, this is heroic and this and that. I'm not saying he's not fucking brave, but if that was on the other side, you'd be claiming that they were child soldiers. Just because your political views one way or another, or how you see it, doesn't mean that the facts of what happens should change. It's still the same. Okay, my rant done. Have a great day. Look after yourselves. And I'll see you very, very soon. Cheers. Thank you.